Shabbat Shalom. We are in the midst of Sukkot. Sukkot is outdoors. Sukkot is light. Sukkot actually was considered, by the way, at one point, the central holiday in Judaism, Chag, and Sukkot is fun, right? It's made a good comeback. So I thought I would share a few fun facts about the Sukkah itself, and then three specific mitzvot that we're supposed to observe on Shabbat after the mitzvah of building a sukkah. So I spent, by the way, this is really true, about 20 hours in a class that I took years and years ago with a traditional teacher who we must have spent 20 hours talking about the dimensions of a sukkah and what was appropriate or not for a skach, that's the thing on top, whether metal could touch it or not, what it could be made of or not. And I remember asking him, do you think anybody is going to ever ask you that question, ask me about these things? He said, no, but you should know it. And no one has ever asked me in 30 years since then. But nevertheless, I'm happy to share with you some memories. The first is there is a maximum height of how high a sukkah can be. Anyone want to venture? I guess I'll give you three options. 15 feet, 30 feet, or 50 feet. Raise your hand if you think it's 15. Raise your hand if you think it's 30. Raise your hand if you think it's 50. Okay, the 30s have it. 30 feet is the maximum. It's supposed to be, Josh, welcome back from England. Josh is in his first year at King's College, having spent the year before traveling around the world on a boat, much of the year, right? Welcome back. You're here for, I'm sorry?
I feel very welcome. Thank you.
Good, we're always happy to have you here. It's supposed to be portable, so that reminding us of the portability when we went through the desert, that we didn't have a fixed place to live because we were running away from the Egyptians and running towards the promised land of Israel. So its temporary nature, it has to have no more than 3 walls, but it can have a minimum of 2.5 walls. And the top, what is known as the skach, has to be of a natural material, so it can be bamboo, it can be palm fronds, it can be all sorts of things, but it has to be an organic material from the ground, and it has to be put up in such a way that there is more shade than sun, but not so much of a cover that you cannot see the stars at night. It also has to be spaced evenly with no gaps wider, I think, than 11 inches. So if you remember all that, you can skip the 20 hours that I spent in school. Also, by the way, the Talmud says it's supposed to be decorated and even makes specific suggestions. It should have, the Talmud actually says handmade carpets. Now I remember thinking, did they have machine-made carpets 2,000 years ago? I don't know, but handmade carpets, tapestries, nuts, almonds, peaches, pomegranates, branches of grapes, vines, decanters, fine meal, and wreaths of corn. That's from the Talmud itself. But in addition to building the sukkah, there are 3 specific mitzvot that we're supposed to fulfill. And any single one of us not only can, but should do it as well. The first is leshev b'sukkah. Leshev doesn't mean to sit in the sukkah. People often think it does, but it means literally to dwell in the sukkah, to live in it. The reason for that, by the way, is so that we can identify with our ancestors as they went through Egypt. They lived in the sukkah. This year, dwelling or even sitting in the sukkah, if we're not going to dwell in it, that's a mitzvah that's pretty doable. Indeed, it's a wonderful mitzvah for us. The second mitzvah is the arba minim, the 4 species, the etrog, which is the citron, the lulav, which is usually a palm frond, the hadassim, which are myrtles, and the aravot, which are willows. And we bring these together and we shake them collectively under the sukkah. This year, that mitzvah also is pretty doable and probably pretty wonderful. But it's the third mitzvah which poses a challenge, because the third mitzvah, remember, the first is leshev, to dwell in the sukkah. The second is the arba minim, the four species, if you will. The third mitzvah is zman simchatenu. Zman simchatenu means it's a season of happiness. It's supposed to be a time of happiness. Now, by the way, that's interesting. Judaism almost never regulates emotions. You cannot have a mitzvah telling people how to feel generally, right? A mitzvah is an action. Yet this is a mitzvah which tells you you're supposed to have a time of happiness. It's supposed to affect our emotions. So I'll read to you where this comes from. It's in the Torah. It's in Devarim, in Deuteronomy. You shall hold a festival for the Lord your God 7 days in the place that the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless all your crops and your undertakings, and you shall have nothing but joy. You shall have nothing but joy. I have to tell you, this year, this mitzvah doesn't feel so doable and doesn't feel so wonderful, especially because it's not been a joyful period in the United States in the last few weeks, and even in Mexico, with a massive earthquake. We've had hurricanes in Florida, in Houston, of course. Parts of the Caribbean have been hit. And then, of course, Sunday night in Las Vegas with the murder of 58 people and 500 people hurt. How are we supposed to exactly have Zman Simchatenu, a time of happiness, a time of rejoicing right now? Maimonides lived about 900 years ago, and I think some of his teachings can be helpful here. This is what he says about Zman Simchatenu and the importance of rejoicing on Sukkot. These are his words. On these days, speaking of Sukkot, a person should be happy and in good spirits, he, his children, his wife, the members of his household, and all who depend on him. And Maimonides goes further. He says, this is how you go about doing it. Give children, and by the way, you can update this to 900 years later. They didn't have video games, but give children roasted seeds and nuts and sweets. Women should buy attractive clothes and jewelry if it's within the financial capacity of the family. Men should eat meat and drink wine because Maimonides says there is no happiness without eating meat or drinking wine. Gotta love Maimonides. I know there are happy vegetarians in the world. I know that. But even then, Maimonides says it's not enough. And this is what he adds, and this I find rather compelling. When a person, these are his words, when a person eats and drinks in celebration of a holiday, he is obligated to feed strangers, orphans, widows, and others who are destitute and poor. And if we eat and drink and don't feed the poor, then Maimonides says we are not rejoicing in the mitzvah, we're just satisfying our hunger. In other words, what we're learning here is we cannot have spiritual joy while others are suffering. To have pleasure and ignore the needs of others, in the eyes of Maimonides, is not rejoicing in the commandment. Now in those days, and again, Maimonides lived in the late, from 1935 or 1933, there's a dispute, I think, or 37 of his birth date, but there's no dispute of his date of death, 1204. So he lived about 900 years ago. In Maimonides' day, you only knew your neighborhood, right? But you knew everybody in your neighborhood, and you knew if your neighbor down the block was suffering, and if you weren't doing anything, Maimonides says you can't rejoice. Today, we know an awful lot about what goes on in the world because of communications. We're much more aware of it. We know what happened. We know when we're facing difficult times. So what are we supposed to do? Well, first, we're supposed to do something for others who are in pain. Then we can rejoice. So we write a check to tzedakah. We send goods when they're needed. We donate blood if that's what we can do. But I would add, by the way, that's a prescription that isn't just helpful on Sukkot. If in general you're feeling sad or you're feeling depressed or you're feeling that you're not having an impact on the world, do something good. Take a step towards alleviating the suffering of others, and I almost can promise you, you're going to feel good about life. In other words, the antidote to depression, the antidote to sadness is doing good for somebody else. And one last related thought. We are reminded that the sukkah is purposefully fragile. It's not supposed to be so strong that it could withstand any forces. Therefore, strong enough forces will bring it down. And ultimately, no matter what with the Sukkah, we take it down. So while it's standing, just like Sukkot, let's find time to rejoice. But that's also true for life, my friends. We all live with a degree of uncertainty. And just like the Sukkah, strong enough forces can bring life down. And ultimately, no matter what, for all of us, life has limits. So while we're here, let's celebrate life. First do some good, and then rejoice. I'm fond of telling you many times the teaching in the Palestinian Talmud. There are two Talmuds, Babylonian and Palestinian, that are being developed in different cities. The Palestinian Talmud says that at the end of our lives, God is going to ask us to account for every legitimate pleasure in life we didn't take advantage of. Is that incredible? Every legitimate pleasure that you didn't take advantage of, God's going to ask you why. This world exists to make it better and to enjoy it along the way. It's a beautiful Jewish message, this holiday, of Zman Simchatenu, a time of happiness. So take the time to rejoice. Do it because you can, do it because you should, and do it because it's a beautiful mitzvah. Shabbat Shalom and Hag Sameach.